Este es Steve Kaufmann, un hombre que ha aprendido más de 20 idiomas por su cuenta. Y en este video voy a tener una conversación con él completamente en inglés. Prepárate, porque este video no solo será una gran práctica para tu escucha y comprensión, sino que también vas a descubrir todos sus secretos y trucos para que tú puedas dominar el inglés mucho más rápido.
All right, Steve, thank you so much for taking your time to chat here with me. I don't know, you probably don't know this, but you have been one of the most influential people for me in my learning and teaching journey, actually. I've been watching, I started watching your videos many, many years ago, and I'm very grateful that I did, because I think if it hadn't been for you and your willingness to share your knowledge, your experience, introducing me to other experts and to the whole science-based learning, I probably wouldn't have helped half the amount of people that I've helped to learn English. So thank you very much for taking your time.
Well, that's very kind of you. I enjoy doing it.
Yeah. What is it about language learning that you love so much? For how long have you been learning languages?
For how long have you been learning languages? ¿Por cuánto tiempo has estado aprendiendo español? For how long have you been living in the US? ¿Por cuánto tiempo has estado viviendo en los Estados Unidos? For how long have you been going to the gym? ¿Por cuánto tiempo has estado yendo al gimnasio? Esta es una estructura gramatical avanzada en inglés que se llama el past perfect, que los nativos de inglés suelen utilizar todo el tiempo. Así que presta mucha atención cada vez que lo escuches y sepas que siempre sigue esa misma estructura. ¿Por cuánto tiempo tú has estado, o tú has sido, o él ha hecho?
What is it about language learning that you love so much? For how long have you been learning languages?
I was born in Sweden. So for the first 5 years of my life, I spoke Swedish. And then we moved to Canada. And my parents said, we're in Canada, now we're going to speak English. My parents weren't Swedish. They were originally from Czechoslovakia. So I forgot my Swedish, and I have no recollection as a kid of transitioning from Swedish into English. You know, there were kids out there playing whatever, and I was there with them, and I guess I began with an accent, and pretty soon I couldn't speak Swedish anymore. But then we had French at school, and I didn't learn much, but I got very keen on French. And once you're motivated, then you can learn. Everyone can learn. It's just a matter of motivation. So I had a very motivating teacher. At one point, after all the boring and uninspiring teachers, I got one guy who turned me on to French, and then I went to France. Then I worked for the Canadian government, and I was sent to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin Chinese, and then we lived in Japan. So it's just one thing after another. So, and what's motivating about learning languages is the fact that you discover other cultures.
Yes. But that's not what creates the motivation in the first hand. You first start learning the language, and then you discover the culture. Or, for example...
No, well, so we were forced to do...
Aquí mi pregunta para Steve era, ¿necesitas tener un interés en la cultura y el país y el idioma antes de empezar a estudiarlo para estar motivado? ¿O puedes simplemente empezar a estudiar inglés y a medida que vayas aprendiendo, vas ganando motivación, vas descubriendo cosas que te interesan en el idioma?
Well, so we were forced to do... If I look at French, which was the first language that I sort of consciously, deliberately had to learn, because the transitioning from Swedish to English was just natural, right? Just surrounded by the language. So it was very boring at school. We had lots of grammar explanations. I could give you the 16 verbs in French that take être as an auxiliary verb and couldn't speak. And it was interesting too, because the whole emphasis at school was on grammar. And yet I can remember once in Montreal, we went to a football game, and the usher was speaking French, and we were trying to explain a situation and all we had was words. We couldn't speak grammatically correctly, even though that was the total emphasis at school. So that convinced me that what we need is words, and with enough words, eventually the grammar sorts itself out. And I can explain that to you later on. But what really motivated me was the professor we had.
With enough words, the grammar then sorts itself out. To sort itself out es una expresión en inglés que significa que se resuelve por sí solo. Entonces él dice, con suficiente vocabulario, la gramática se resuelve por sí solo. Entonces no tienes que enfocarte en estudiar un montón de gramática como le ponían a él a estudiar en el colegio, porque igual no la vas a poder usar. Todas esas palabritas de gramática que encuentras entre vocabulario, entre palabras, en oraciones y lo que escuchas, las vas a adquirir de forma natural a medida que vayas consumiendo el idioma. No tienes que estudiar las reglas gramaticales. Eso fue lo que él dijo.
What
Yeah.
really motivated me was the professor we had who taught us French civilization, French history, and so that did turn me on. And at every stage where I have, gotten interested in a language, it's because of the history and particularly the history. Now,
Okay.
I think learning English is a little different because English is actually the international language, par excellence. So you don't have to be motivated by American or British history or culture to learn English. But if you're going to learn Persian, which I'm doing right now, then interest in Iran is a major part of it, and Persian history.
Of course. How many languages do you speak, more or less?
It's always a difficult question. So some I have learned and forgotten. I learned Romanian and Greek before going there, and then now I would have trouble speaking in those languages. However, anytime you learn a language, it's still in there somewhere. You just have to revive it. But 20 would be the number that I use most often. 20. So some I speak a lot better than others, but I have at various times studied, learned, been able to communicate, been able to understand 20 languages.
Me encanta lo que dices sobre el tema de que tú puedes revivir un idioma. Si has estudiado inglés en el pasado y lo has olvidado, no estás empezando desde cero. Todas esas cosas que estudiaste todavía están ahí, no se han desaparecido. Va a ser más fácil para ti ahora revivir ese inglés y get up to par, como decimos en inglés. Get up to par. Estar up to par significa estar en un nivel esperado. Entonces no te preocupes si hayas olvidado un montón de inglés porque vas a poderlo recuperar muy rápido. Porque si empiezas a estudiar de nuevo te vas a dar cuenta que vas a estar de vuelta súper rápido.
I have at various times studied, learned, been able to communicate, been able to understand 20 languages.
Okay. I think everyone would agree it seems easy for you to learn languages, especially if you've learned 20 over the years. But what's the biggest difference in the way that you learn versus how students normally learn languages in school? Let's say English, for example.
Well, first of all, I don't put pressure on myself. So right now I've been learning 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish for the last 6 years.
Nuevamente la misma estructura. I've been learning. Aquí tenemos una contracción entre I have. I have been learning. Yo he estado aprendiendo. O I've been learning. He estado aprendiendo. Una estructura gramatical que se utiliza en inglés todo el tiempo.
So right now I've been learning 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish for the last 6 years. And I'm not tremendously fluent in any of them. Now, the only time I learned a language under pressure was when I was learning Mandarin Chinese, because I was a Canadian government, employee, diplomat. I had to learn. They paid me. I had my salary every day. I had to spend 7 hours a day learning Mandarin Chinese. So that was very intense. But otherwise, I think I focus on getting the language in me, building up a background in the language, because the way we learn is that the way we start to be able to do things in the language is if we have given our brain enough exposure to the language that we start to get the ability to infer. We can't infer based on reasoning and logic. We infer based on a process that we don't control, which is the result of having accumulated so much data, much like AI. There's so much data there that we can start to anticipate what's coming in the language. And therefore, my strategy always is to do a lot of listening and reading.
Yes. And that's what you've seen most students don't spend enough time doing in school, listening and reading?
Yeah, people, for a variety of reasons, either the teacher is anxious to have the learners perform. The learners are keen to perform. They're worried about what they can say early on, which is not the way to go. You have to build up this capability within yourself to
Me encanta esta perspectiva. No te debes preocupar por cómo hablas el idioma cuando empiezas a estudiarlo, porque la única forma de poder hablar un idioma es tener una base sólida memorizada primero. Si no has leído y escuchado suficiente inglés, no vas a poder hablar. Entonces memorizar frases o memorizar listas de palabras solamente te va a dar la ilusión falsa de que sabes algo en el idioma. La gran diferencia entre cómo Steve aprende idiomas y cómo todos los demás tratan de aprender idiomas en colegios o universidades es que él al inicio se enfoca únicamente en leer y escuchar el idioma. No se preocupa por nada más. Nada de reglas gramaticales, nada de hablar, nada de pronunciación y nada de escribir. Solo leer y escuchar.
They're worried about what they can say early on, which is not the way to go. You have to build up this capability within yourself to process the language, get used to the language, and on the base of that, on that base, you can then explore the grammar. You can gradually become more accurate in your use of the language, in your pronunciation. But I think people are either because of the teacher or because pressure that people put on themselves, they are in too much of a hurry to perform in the language rather than giving themselves the chance to get used to the language.
Exactly. And they might be doing things more ineffectively or might focus on the non-essential things. Like,
yes.
For example, speaking early on, or for example, a heavy focus on grammar, things like that, rather than just focus on pure reading and listening for enjoyment or for curiosity.
Exactly. I think you have to be willing to accept that the language is going to be unclear for a long time. You're going to continue forgetting words for a long time. The same words that you have now, you looked it up 5 times, and the next time you see the word, you still don't know what it means. Even in a limited sense, because words can have different meanings in different contexts. But it's a very slow process. People are in too big of a hurry. They get frustrated when they forget. They get frustrated when they don't understand. And actually, it's a slow, gradual process. And as long as you continue enjoying the language, you will improve.
Yeah.
So you need to have that confidence.
Esto también es genial. Abraza el olvido. Olvidar es natural. No hay suficiente espacio en tu cerebro para interiorizar todas las palabras a cuales te expones todos los días. Vas a ver una palabra 10 veces y todavía no la vas a poder saber usar. El aprendizaje toma tiempo y necesitas mucha exposición. No solo 10 veces, cientos de veces a las mismas palabras para que se quemen ahí adentro en tu memoria.
They get frustrated when they forget. They get frustrated when they don't understand. And actually, it's a slow, gradual process. And as long as you continue enjoying the language, you will improve.
Yeah.
So you need to have that confidence.
I love that. So basically what you're saying is you should just continue consuming the language over time and not give up. Not put so much pressure on yourself, not so much stress, and focus on listening and reading and find the enjoyment of the material that you're consuming rather than just good at the language itself.
Right. So do things that you enjoy doing. Exactly. Find things that you enjoy doing. It might be a certain kind of content. It might be songs. It might be anything. Maybe you like grammar, then do grammar. But you need to spend time with the language. So if you're reading a grammar book, say an English grammar book, and I've looked at some English grammar books, and they're so complicated. Like I'm a native speaker, and I can't understand what they're talking about when they try to explain when you use this tense versus that tense. Develop some habits in the language. Some might be right, some might be wrong, but don't obsess. Don't try to remember. Don't try to use logic or deduction. It has to be an inference. It has to be a natural reaction that is the result of all the effort you've put into listening and reading, so that when you go to speak, you're more likely to have, the correct inference, the correct result.
Te voy a probar que esto es verdad. Un error súper típico que los latinos cometen al hablar inglés es decir I am agree. Esto no es correcto en inglés. En inglés decimos simplemente I agree. Yo concuerdo. Lo que estás haciendo que está causando este error es que estás traduciendo literalmente del español al inglés. Y esto lo haces porque no has consumido suficiente inglés. No has leído y escuchado suficiente. Si hubieras leído y escuchado suficiente inglés, te habrías expuesto a la frase correcta tantas veces que se sentiría tan raro decir I am agree en lugar de I agree, que es lo que habrás escuchado todo el tiempo. Entonces abraza la lectura y la escucha.
It has to be an inference. It has to be a natural reaction that is the result of all the effort you've put into listening and reading, so that when you go to speak, you're more likely to have, the correct inference, the correct result. And if you get it wrong, then there will be an error correction that starts to take place in the brain. But you cannot use logic or deduction or trying to remember grammar rules. That's only going to trip you up.
I get it.
I get it. Lo entiendo. jerga en inglés, como lo tengo, pero significa entiendo. Es lo mismo que I understand, pero más nativo. I get it.
I get it. So, fantastic. So, basically, like a main principle that I think many people listening to this would benefit from adopting is focus on letting the language come naturally. Don't force your understanding. Try to learn the language subconsciously rather than consciously. Instead of analyzing the language through rules and explanations and theory, try to let the language come to you as it came to you with your native language. Without putting pressure on yourself and having a big focus on reading and listening. Would you say that is the big difference between how you...
Absolutely. Lots of listening and reading, and speak every opportunity you get, but don't second guess yourself. Like, rely on your instincts. Some might be wrong. I again get back to this idea of inference. You may get it wrong, you may get it right. Getting it wrong is a good thing, because you may get it wrong the next time, but eventually there will be a correction that takes place there. So nothing wrong with getting it wrong. Learn to accept mistakes. And if you are able to confirm that a certain word works for you, that you thought might be appropriate in this circumstance, you tried it out, it worked, that also reaffirms that that's the correct. So that's that whole, they call it a probabilistic error correction process.
Okay.
And so that's what it is. Yeah. And don't get upset. Just enjoy it.
So you mean, what about error correction? So do you think people should actively try to correct their errors, or just continue consuming more, continue reading and listening, and they will just automatically correct their mistakes?
Yeah, I think a lot of the correction is automatic, and you sometimes hear people say, well, mothers correct their children in the native language. That's simply not true. We know that, in fact, no. In English, people begin by getting, the past tense kids. At age 4, they might say goed instead of went. Yeah. But eventually they figure it out. And it's not because the mother tells them it's went instead of goed. That's not true. People learn mostly from the language that they're sort of exposed to. But there's nothing wrong with looking up grammar explanations. If you're curious about something, I look things up. How many times have I looked at conjugation tables in Spanish? But it doesn't have a big impact, actually.
Okay.
It's sort of, once you have so much experience with the language, it might confirm what you already intrinsically know. But the ability to get corrected and get it wrong the next time, I know that, like on Link.
Me encanta esto. Este es uno de los principios que a mí me encanta reiterar porque es tan importante. No te preocupes tanto por tus errores. Y no te preocupas tanto por pedir correcciones de los demás en tu inglés, porque según la ciencia de aprendizaje de idiomas, te vas a autocorregir a medida que vayas escuchando y leyendo más. Un niño en inglés, igual como tú aprendiendo inglés, recuerda que tú eres un niño en el idioma inglés, va a decir I go, yo voy en el tiempo presente, y va a decir I goed en el pasado. Y esto es incorrecto, ¿verdad? Sabemos que voy en el pasado en inglés, fui o iba, se dice I went, ¿cierto? Pero este es un verbo irregular. Y es por eso que el niño comete el error, porque no está tan acostumbrado de los verbos irregulares todavía. Y no fue porque su mamá le corregía en el momento y decía, no, hijo, se dice I went en el pasado. Fue porque durante los próximos 5 años seguía escuchando mucho inglés y solo escuchaba I went, I went, I went. Ahora tú, como aprendiz más experimentado, vas a simplemente sentir que se dice I went en lugar de I goed.
Once you have so much experience with the language, it might confirm what you already intrinsically know. But the ability to get corrected and get it wrong the next time, I know that, like on Link, I have lessons with my tutor, and I get a report from my tutor, and it has all my mistakes in there. She makes phrases and sentences.
Link es la plataforma de aprendizaje de idiomas de Steve, que él y muchos otros políglotas, los que hablan muchos idiomas, utilizan para aprender otros idiomas. En mi opinión, es una de las mejores plataformas que existen ahí afuera para aprender idiomas.
I have lessons with my tutor, and I get a report from my tutor, and it has all my mistakes in there. She makes phrases and sentences out of my mistakes, and I make the same mistakes week after week. And I know when I was teaching English at Link that I could correct them in the same hour. They would make the same mistake again. So corrections have limited, it's not bad, might help you notice certain things, but that's not going to correct you. It's going to maybe remind you of something that you will forget.
I love that, because I think most of my students, busy people, they have jobs. Some of them have several jobs. They have big families. They have limited time to spend on learning languages. So they want to learn in the most effective way with the minimal amount of effort or time spent possible, even though you should never have like that mentality of, I'm going to do the least amount of work just to learn the language.
Right.
So I still think it's important for everyone to understand the difference in principles. Like, what's the principle of learning? What's the big difference? Like, what's the one thing? And I think that is focus on learning the language naturally. What does that mean?
Right.
Just read and listen and let the language come to you naturally. Don't worry about your mistakes. Don't put too much effort on correcting your mistakes or having a professor correct your mistake. Understand that language learning is a natural process. And if you don't put too much pressure on yourself, if you're relaxed, if you're stress-free, you will absorb the language and learn it faster, more easily, and with less frustration.
And I mean, you should speak too, where you have the opportunity. I'm not saying you shouldn't speak, but when you speak, just use what you have. Try it out. See what happens. What I find is when I start speaking, and I will normally wait until I have a certain level of vocabulary and comprehension. Otherwise, my conversations are so limited if I'm learning a new language.
Me encanta. Dice, I will normally wait. Primero aquí tenemos una oración en el tiempo verbal futuro en inglés. I will, que significa yo voy a. También se podría decir I'm going to. I am going to. I will wait o I am going to wait. I will wait es como yo esperaré. I am going to wait es como yo voy a esperar. La misma cosa. Y me encanta lo que él dice. I will typically wait to speak. Normalmente esperaré para hablar. Porque si empezara a hablar de una, sería una experiencia frustrante. Y me encanta que él dice eso porque muchos de ustedes piensan que para hablar mejor inglés tienen que hablar todo el tiempo. Y eso no es verdad. La causa del aprendizaje es exposición al idioma. El leer y escuchar. Y no tienes que hablar hasta que te sientas listo.
What I find is when I start speaking, and I will normally wait until I have a certain level of vocabulary and comprehension. Otherwise, my conversations are so limited if I'm learning a new language that it's pointless. I'm far better off at an early stage to do a lot of listening and reading to build up some familiarity with the language. But at a certain point, I want to speak. But I don't worry about how many mistakes I make. If you're afraid of making mistakes, you will never improve. You have to make those mistakes, and then you become even more aware of where your gaps are, where your weaknesses are. And then when you listen and read, naturally, you're going to focus in on those areas more. So it's a constant, again, iterative process. Yeah. But you should not be afraid of making mistakes when you speak. And you do have to speak. Eventually, you have to speak a lot.
Yeah.
But you have to continue your input, your listening and reading too.
I know I have a maybe a little more radical view on the whole speaking thing. I encourage my students to not speak until they feel ready, or until if they don't need to speak. I encourage them, to focus on listening and reading, and use speaking practice as a way to get confidence rather than improving your speaking per se. Am I wrong with that, or?
No, I think there's a number of things there where we completely agree. Number one, do things that you like to do. Don't put yourself in situations where you feel pressure and you're going to be unhappy, because the most important thing is that you continue, that you persevere. So I have found that unless I'm about to go to the country, if I need right now to improve my speaking, then I might get on with a tutor. Otherwise, I wait until I have 3,000 to 5,000 words on LINC, the way we count words at LINC. So once I have that level, then I might speak twice a week. And it's also, as you say, it improves your input activity, it improves your listening and reading, because you become aware of where your gaps are. But I think you should do what you want to do. If you want to speak, some people want to speak early, go for it. If you don't feel like speaking at all for a year, don't. It's so important to maintain your motivation. And as long as you're engaged with the language, and that's where reading a grammar book in your native language is not being engaged with the language. You want to be engaged with the language without the native language. And so to that extent, speak whenever you want. I agree with you. Whenever you feel like it, go for it.
I love that. So let's let's get a little more technical then.
Okay.
What's the best learning method? So we've gotten to the conclusion that the best way to learn, generally speaking, is to find an input-based method, a method that focuses on reading and listening. And you speak, and you don't worry about your mistakes, and you don't focus too much on error correction. You engage in the language. What like real methods are there that are good? I know you talk a lot about mini stories. I also teach with a story-based method. But what is it about this method that makes it so effective, and how does it work?
Well, of course, I learn on my language learning website, Link.
Yes.
And I use the mini stories to get into a new language because there's so much repetition. The vocabulary repeats in each story because it's told from one person or tense, another person or tense, and there's some questions. And so the same vocabulary repeats. So I initially do a lot of listening. But then as I advance in the learning sort of levels, then I want to get at content that's more interesting. So right now, for my Persian, what I do is, so on Link, I can go to a course. Let's say it could be a podcast. I have this fascinating podcast from a fellow in Iran. And so I'll just put on, playlists, like all the different episodes of his podcast. And so as I'm listening to them, the great thing about listening is it triggers your curiosity, because when you're listening, you don't understand. Like you understand 30, 40, 50, 60%. You're motivated. So motivation, curiosity is very important. Okay, I missed that. What was it? So now I want to go read. So when I go read, I read online on Link because I can look up the words. And again, in the Arabic script, sometimes I can't pronounce the word, so I can hear it pronounced, right? You're online, you can go text to speech, you can look up words, dictionary. My system keeps track of what I know and what I don't know. And so new words, as I'm on a page, then I can go through those. Like I'm not a big fan of Anki and these, spaced repetition systems. I want to review my vocabulary right then and there it's like I have a page. On that page, there were 10 words that I didn't know. I read through that page. Now I want to review those 10 words. Or I can look at those 10 words before I start, read through it, and look at those 10 words afterwards. To me, when it comes to vocabulary, any kind of vocabulary review, spaced repetition, whatever, has to be a small number and has to be closely related to the text you are about to read or just finished reading.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through 200 or 500 or 1,000 words because the brain requires new things. You can't keep on doing the same thing over and over and over. The brain tunes out. It's not going to work. Whereas if it's close to, and we know again from studying the brain, that if we start to see vocabulary being associated with other words within a specific meaningful context, the brain has an easier time remembering those. Whereas frequency alone is not the whole story. I think people have been sold this idea that's frequency and spaced repetition, and it's all about seeing it often. It's more than seeing it often. You have to see it in certain contexts. So context that's
and in different contexts.
In different contexts, exactly. And then the brain starts to notice it better. Starts to anticipate. I mentioned inference. It's got to learn. It's got to be able to anticipate what's coming next, so you can cope with what's happening. That's how we get through life. I mean, I can almost anticipate. You can anticipate what I'm about to do, and vice versa, because of all the experience we have through life. So you have to rely on that ability to anticipate, and that is developed through meeting words in a variety of different contexts.
When you're a complete beginner in a new language, you're starting from basically zero words. Is the mini stories the first thing you do, or is there something else you do before going into that?
Okay, so before we had Link, of course, I used to go to a starter series, Teach Yourself or Assimil or any of these. I like Teach Yourself, but now I go straight to the mini stories. That's what I did for Arabic. That's what I did for Persian, Turkish, because there's so much repetition.
How long is a mini story, or how many sentences?
So we have 60 mini stories that are the same in every language. Each mini story basically says, John went to the store, he bought some cheese. And then I went to the store, I will go to the store and buy some cheese. So the same vocabulary repeats. And then we have what we call circling questions. John went to the library. Did John go to the store? No, he went to the library. So in other words, all the same vocabulary. So there's 60 of them. I go through the first one. One of the very important things, I think, when you start in a new language is listening and learning. There's stages. So you got to first of all become conscious of the word boundaries, like when one word ends and the next word begins, because at first it's just noise, right?
Yeah.
So by listening long enough, listening and reading, you begin to get a sense of the word boundaries. You still can't remember the words, and you keep on listening and listening. So early on, lots of listening, but listening together with reading, where there's a lot of repetition, so you start to get a toehold on the language.
We teach with a story-based method as well. What we do is we have short stories as well, but in the first thing that they do, starting from zero, is that they have a story in English with English subtitles, and then they have like a small translation in Spanish after every sentence to listen to a few times so that they actually understand the story. And once they feel comfortable, they advance to the next step, which is the same story, but without the Spanish subtitles, just the English subtitles. And
that's very good.
And then then it's about, listening over and over again until you're able to understand the story without the subtitles. So that's the third step, without the subtitles, completely just the audio. And then we add the fourth step, where we introduce questions as well. We don't read we don't have the story in different grammar tenses. I think that's a cool idea. But we do ask questions as well about the same sentences that they've been listening to now for a while.
Right. Yeah. No, that's key.
Story. Yeah. Then they go to a different story with a different theme, different vocabulary. Right. But this whole method, do you think that's a good?
It's very good. And we've all had the experience. We know all the words kind of, but we still can't make sense of a sentence. And if you have the translation, things kind of fall into place. So there are purists who say, you should never use your native language and stuff. I don't agree with that at all. Yeah. If you can see the translation, you're struggling. What does this mean? I got the words. I don't know what it means. And then you see it in your native language, and all of a sudden it falls into place. And then you're able to read that, and it becomes meaning to you, natural meaning. So interspersed or sentence by sentence translation into the native language is an important sort of stage in getting to where, ultimately the goal is you hear it, it's meaning. You read it, it's meaning. It takes a long time to get there. And so what you're doing there is helping people, move in that direction for sure.
Yeah, perfect. And then, as their level increases, the stories get more difficult, longer sentences.
Very good. Yeah.
More complex vocabulary, and then we transition into like a free consumption based method. So once you've done all the stories, which is like the first 4 chapters of my course, then the chapter 5 and 6 is all about free consumption, where they actually go out or go into the internet and just find content that they like and try to do an hour a day or 2 hours a day.
Sure.
With content that interests them. Yeah, so I think that's great for people to understand that you can translate from your own language to English. You can use translations to learn, and as a complete beginner, you can actually start listening to complete sentences. You don't have to study, the verb to be in its present tense, and then with all the subjects and how the conjugation is. You don't have to study individual words in a list. You can actually go about consuming real English in real stories with just a few helpers, and that's going to be way more effective. With the literature I've read, or the science I've read, it says it's easier to remember a word or to learn a word when you see it in context, when you see it in a phrase. And so doing that from the beginning, even though you might not think you're able to understand a complete sentence, is smart, because you can learn grammar and vocabulary at the same time. And fast.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the grammar explanations, I often liken it to, if someone, say you're somewhere you haven't been before, and you say, where's the post office? And the person says, well, you go down this street, you turn left after 100 meters, and then you turn right. It gives you a lengthy, the instructions on how to get there. The minute you leave that person, you've forgotten all the instructions.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have been there before, if you have walked that path before, then his explanations refer to something that you're already familiar with. And grammar is a bit like that. If you have enough experience with the language, the grammar explanations can be, at least they make sense. But until you have enough experience with the language, the grammar explanations. So I would never begin with grammar. I think you have to begin with exposure to the language, definitely. One other thing I would say is that when you're talking about free consumption of the language, we live in a period where you can access any language. You can get in English in particular. You can get podcasts on bird watching, like whatever you might be interested in. It's there. And so most of my learning is, say, Persian, or even in Persian, there's not as much stuff available as, let's say, in English. But if I can get a hold of the MP3 file, I bring it into Link, it gets automatically transcribed. I have a lesson.
That's great news for everyone learning English. I wish I could learn English again from zero. That would have been fun. Yeah. Okay, now the question I probably get the most from my audience is, how do I stop translating in my head? I understand a lot, but I can't speak. What should I do? I know I have my way of answering this. I would love to hear your quick take on this.
It's kind of similar to the related languages. How do I start thinking in the language?
The same question, basically.
Same question. So, to me,
Es la misma pregunta. ¿Cómo dejo de traducir en mi cabeza? ¿Y cómo puedo empezar a pensar en inglés? Es el mismo proceso, exponiéndote a mucho de ese idioma para que tengas tantas estructuras y tantas palabras interiorizadas en tu memoria que cuando vayas a hablar o vayas a escribir, simplemente por intuición te sale el inglés primero.
It's kind of similar to the related languages. How do I start thinking in the language?
The same question, basically.
Same question. So, to me, improving in a language is a very gradual, seamless process of improvement. So you begin and you're very much translating into your own language. You have to refer the new language. There has to be a reference to something you already know. But gradually you will discover, if you continue listening and reading, if you continue speaking, gradually you do that less and less. So more and more of the language as you hear it and read it is meaning. But it's slow, and there will always be periods when you're translating. Even languages that I speak quite well, I notice some things come out naturally. Like, we have these natural instincts in the language that we've developed, habits that work. We've tried these phrases before, they work, we use them naturally. And then there are other moments when we are subconsciously translating from our own language, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's inevitable.
Me encanta. You will never fully stop translating. You will never fully stop translating. Siempre vas a estar traduciendo del español al inglés. Solo que por cada mes que estés consumiendo el idioma, va a ser un poco menos. Es un proceso muy gradual y muy lento. Y no tiene nada de malo. Simplemente así como funciona, hay que aceptarlo y probablemente nunca vas a dejar de traducir por completo. Y eso está bien.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's inevitable.
And the speaking will come, and the fluency will come. The more you consume.
The more you consume, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if I'm speaking Spanish and I have to think of when to use the subjunctive, I can't. Like, some things will, que le vaya bien. Okay, it'll come out naturally for certain expressions, and for certain other expressions, it'll be wrong. Or like ser and estar. I'll continue to make it wrong, get it wrong a lot of the time, but sometimes I'll get it right. So it's a matter of you will gradually improve your natural instincts in the new language, your natural ability to not rely on translation. All you can really control is to put in as much time as you can every day into listening and reading and speaking.
I followed a very famous Brazilian English teacher called Mauro Vergara. And he said something that I think was very intelligent. He said, your ability to speak is a direct consequence of a high level of comprehension.
Oh, absolutely.
So the more you understand, the better you're going to speak. It's just going to develop a little slower. It's just not going to be...
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, translating in your head, it could also be taking place when you're listening and reading. I know Myro, by the way. I spoke to him 20 years ago and when I was getting started as well.
Okay.
But you do get people who say, I have good comprehension, but I can't speak. And when I go to speak, I stumble and it annoys me. I understand and so forth. Most of the time, I found that those people, then I challenge them.
They don't have as good a comprehension as they say. They
exactly.
Say
Exactly. And so I get that. Like in Vancouver, we had a lot of people from China, immigrants. Oh yeah, we China. They love to generalize. We Chinese, we read, but we don't speak well. I say, okay, what was the last book you read in English, from cover to cover? They don't. In other words, it's not to read a newspaper article or something online. That's not reading. Reading is you settle into your sofa or whatever, and you read a book. You read a whole book. That's comprehension, when you can understand the book. There was actually a Swedish lady, wife of one of our business associates, and she spoke French not too badly, and so I gave her an audiobook.
Yeah.
She said she couldn't understand the audiobook. I was flabbergasted. Her French wasn't that bad, but she couldn't understand an audiobook. So comprehension. You should be able to understand an audiobook. You should be able to read a book. I mean, that is, you don't do that at an early stage in the language, but the goal you want to get to is you can understand podcasts, you can understand audiobooks, you can read books. All of that assumes a high level of vocabulary. And I have always said that the best measure is how many words you know. So vocabulary is key. If you know a lot of words, even passively, through your massive listening and reading, not all of them are available to use as active vocabulary, but more and more of them eventually will be. My thing is, keep on working on your input activities. Try to use as much vocabulary as you can when you're speaking. Don't worry about your mistakes. And you'll find that gradually you will think more and more in the target language, in English, in your case, that you're teaching English. And you'll translate less and less from your own language.
I like that. I want to hear your thoughts on my measurement for you. I always tell my students, like, the best measurement or the best measure for your level in English is how well you understand, or how good your comprehension is. And how good your comprehension is often directly correlated to how many hours that you've been sitting down and actively listening and reading to the language at a level that's a little challenging, or like at your level at least.
Comprehension, of course, requires vocabulary.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to listen to simple things.
Do you know the reason I don't go into word counts is because literature I've been reading says that you learn words by reading them in context, like with a lot of other words, like in sentences.
Right.
And then also, how do you know when you have learned a word?
Right.
How many exposures, how many times do you need to see a word before you know it? In how many different contexts?
Right.
How do you measure that?
My answer to that is, any of these measures are simply their milestones, things that you can measure. So, for example, at Link, we can measure how many words you know.
Yeah.
I don't know how accurate it is, but the basic principle is that if you're reading a page on Link, any word that you don't look up, you know. Otherwise, if you didn't know it, you would have looked it up.
Aquí tenemos la principal diferencia en cómo nosotros medimos el avance de nuestros estudiantes. Steve le gusta medir vocabulario, palabras, con la hipótesis de que si tú no buscas una palabra, se asume de que la sepas. Siento que eso puede enredar un poco, entonces yo siempre les he dicho, enfócate en la cantidad de horas que dedicas a leer y escuchar el idioma a diario. Preferiblemente 1 hora al día, y vas a ver que tu vocabulario se expande. Obviamente tienes que ver algo que es relativamente desafiante para ti. Tiene que haber cosas desconocidas, y de pronto eso puede ser un poco más fácil de captar. Pero independientemente de tu preferencia en cómo medir tu avance, lo importante es medirlo y poder mirar hacia adelante en tu proceso de aprendizaje y tener una meta o tener una misión. Por ejemplo, en Rayo, queremos que los estudiantes alcancen por lo mínimo 1000 horas de exposición al idioma, porque sabemos que si tú logras 1000 horas, vas a estar mucho más cerca de esa capacidad de comprensión que Steve menciona, cuando puedes poner audiolibros y entender todo, cuando puedes leer un libro sin traducciones, cuando puedes ver una película sin subtítulos, porque es cuando tú llegas a ese nivel de comprensión que vas a poder hablar y escribir bien también.
You know. Otherwise, if you didn't know it, you would have looked it up. So it gives us a way of measuring, somewhat inaccurate, but an indication of your vocabulary.
That's fantastic.
So, because what I believe is, I think what schools get wrong is they try to measure how proficient someone is in a language.
Speaking,
Okay, you're a
writing, or
anything. They say, oh, you're A2 or B1 or B2 or you're 9 out of 10 or whatever it might be.
Get, un verbo súper común en inglés que tiene un montón de diferentes significados. Aquí Steve lo usa de la siguiente forma. What school gets wrong. En este contexto, se podría traducir a do, hacer. What school does wrong. Lo que la escuela hace mal. Es lo mismo que what school gets wrong. Lo que hacen mal o lo que entienden mal, lo que todavía no han entendido. Entonces esté atento a ese verbo get, porque es muy común y se puede utilizar de muchas diferentes formas. Si quieres ver un video mío donde yo desgloso todos los diferentes significados del verbo get, con un montón de frases y expresiones, oraciones completas, de ejemplos, simplemente busca en YouTube Kalle Anders Get y ahí lo encontrarás.
I think what schools get wrong is they try to measure how proficient someone is in a language.
speaking,
Okay, you're a
writing, or
anything. They say, oh, you're A2 or B1 or B2 or you're 9 out of 10 or whatever it might be. And I think that those results are not very meaningful because it can vary. Okay, some people speak better, some people understand better. You might be better on one day than on another day. The only thing that we like to measure at Lincoln that I think is important and which motivates me is how active am I? So your level of activity. It's almost a measure of your activity level. So you can measure hours, you can measure words that I looked up, you can measure hours of listening, you can measure words of reading. I mean, if I look at Link, for example, in Russian, I've read 1.5 million words. In Czech, I've read 1 million words. I'm getting close to 1 million words in Persian. That tells me I've been very active.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I know all those words. It just means I've been very active. So it's just a different way of measuring your level of activity. And the key thing is, and I think that's where we agree, it's how active you are.
Yeah, how active you are and that you actually measure. There's
Right.
a famous business saying that goes, what gets measured gets managed.
Right.
So,
Yes.
yeah. And if it's based on consumption, so how many words you expose yourself to or how many hours you spend listening and reading, it's good. Perfect. Great. Steve, what about pronunciation? What does a Spanish-speaking person, for example,
What about pronunciation? ¿Qué hay de la pronunciación? Una expresión muy común. What about? ¿Y qué hay de tal cosa?
Steve, what about pronunciation? What does a Spanish-speaking person, for example, need to know before going about learning English pronunciation? What methods can they use and what principles should they?
Okay. Principle number one, I just happened to watch on Twitter, they interviewed this Italian former prime minister of Italy, and he was talking about the economic situation. And his English, his use of English, his control of vocabulary, the elegance of how he used the language was like off the charts. But he had a noticeable Italian accent. In my experience, that's the ideal.
I mean, you say no to public debt. You say no to the single market. You say no to create the capital market union. You can't say no to everything. Otherwise, you have also to admit, to be consistent, that you are not able to deliver on the fundamental values for which this European Union has been created. So when you ask me what is best to do now, I say, I have no idea, but do something.
If you are a non-native speaker and you can use the language so well and have such obvious command of vocabulary and so forth and so on, it's almost better to have a little accent. It almost elevates. You end up respecting that person more. And the worst thing is if you don't have a really good hold of the language, but you're hi, how they hanging? Yeah, well, what's up? And trying to be very slangy when you obviously don't have a very high level in the language. That's the worst. So pronunciation it's important that people understand you. You don't have to be native-like. So that's the first thing. Now, insofar as we want to have a level of pronunciation that makes the listener, which in many cases is the native speaker, comfortable. If the native speaker is saying, I beg your pardon, what did you say? That's not a good sign, okay? So you want to make that person feel comfortable. But that doesn't mean that you have to pretend that you are the native speaker.
Comfortable, una de las palabras más difíciles de pronunciar en inglés. Confortable, cómodo. Comfortable. Hay muchas letras que no se pronuncian. Repite después de mí. Comfortable. 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 Muy bien.
Comfortable. If the native speaker is saying, I beg your pardon, what did you say? That's not a good sign, okay? So you want to make that person feel comfortable. But that doesn't mean that you have to pretend that you are the native speaker. A big thing is rhythm and intonation. So obviously Spanish, and even there's a big difference between Spain and Mexico and Chile and Argentina. Each one of those countries, and even within those countries, there are different sort of rhythms, okay? But I think in working on pronunciation, you should try to get the rhythm of the language. The rhythm of English is very different from the rhythm of French, which is different from Japanese and so forth. So the rhythm of the language is important. As a Spanish speaker, Spanish typically has fewer vowels than a lot of other languages.
Yes.
And so, there are some sounds that you might want to work on to expand your range and get into some diphthongs, getting technical here, but you got to be a little more flexible when it comes to vowels as a Spanish speaker speaking English. My approach is in pronunciation, a lot of it happens naturally. You have to have sympathy for the language. So when I use this term cultural weightlessness, okay? I'm not uptight. I'm an English-speaking Canadian and I'm going to speak this language and I'm hanging on to my English pronunciation. No, you kind of have to let go. I'm just a man from Mars. And so you have to try to fit in without worrying, without being too self-conscious. Enjoy it. You have to enjoy being in the company of those people. And I think if you have sympathy with the people and the language, then the pronunciation will be easier. Second of all, focus on intonation and rhythm.
Yeah.
And then pick a few sounds. So as a non-native speaker of Spanish, everyone focus on the R, for example, r, rincón. So people are going to focus on, because that for an English speaker is difficult. So you've got to identify a small, in Swedish, there are sounds that are difficult.
Yeah.
Focus in on those difficult sounds, yet accept that you may never master them. But I would focus in on a small number of sounds, get the rhythm of the language.
¿Cómo así difícil? Super fácil. Sueco.
In Swedish, there are sounds that are difficult.
Yeah.
Focus in on those difficult sounds, yet accept that you may never master them. But I would focus in on a small number of sounds, get the rhythm of the language, and have some sympathy with the language and the culture.
Yeah. I love that you say focus on the sounds, because it's all about sounds, isn't it? It's not about trying to learn how to pronounce every word individually correctly.
Right.
It's going to take forever to learn pronunciation. And I also love that you say a lot happens naturally. So the more you listen to English and English sounds, the easier it is to imitate English sounds.
Absolutely.
The easier it is to let go of your natural accent and trying to fit in. If you actually have a lot of hours or a lot of vocabulary, like a lot of exposure to the language, it's going to be easier. So that's why, for example, in my course, we put pronunciation classes that are focused on sounds, particularly, but we put them at the end of the course, like last chapter. The last thing you do is that we talk about sounds and grammar at the end, where you have gotten enough exposure, enough input where you can actually, where that sort of information is more useful and you can perfect rather than trying to build from zero based on a base you don't actually have.
I think that's interesting that you sort of lump grammar and pronunciation together. There are all kinds of things that you're not going to notice. Like we talk about natural learning and you're acquiring the language naturally through lots of listening and reading, and lots of good things happen just by doing that. But there will be things that you don't notice. In a number of languages, for example, European Portuguese or Russian or English, there are vowel sounds that are not pronounced. Like if that particular syllable is not accented, it will not be pronounced. You may not notice that. You might want to say walked. I walked to the store, and you continue saying it. Even though you hear walked, you didn't notice it. So a lot of things like that. But if you give that person, up front, you say in English, if you see walked, it's actually walked. It's too much information. But once the person has had enough exposure to the language, in my opinion, he's not going to fossilize bad pronunciation, but he has a bit of a base so that if you go back in there, and I've seen this in Russian, where the O becomes the A when it's not accentuated, and once you've had enough exposure. But if you give people too much information up front, it just goes in one ear and out the other.
Fantastic. Perfect. It's funny because I actually used that example, walked in one of my pronunciation classes.
Right.
But since it's at the end of the course, there's no problem, right? Because they will have heard that word 1,000 times when they get there. So
And you know, the interesting thing is the resistance of people. So we have a Spanish person at Link. I know. So SWORD, sword, right? Sword. Which doesn't make sense. It's totally illogical. To her, it's sword.
Yeah.
Sword. No, it's not sword. It's sword. Oh, okay, thank you. It's still sword. Like the ability to correct pronunciation, we have to be realistic. Like people have certain habits, very hard to let go of them.
It comes back to the listening again. I mean, maybe they need to even hear themselves.
Right.
Notice their own mistakes rather than you correcting them or someone correcting them, actually hearing themselves. That's a tiny thing that I do in my pronunciation part of my course. At the end is I teach them the sounds. I teach them how to move their mouth and the tongue to produce the sound.
Right.
We practice with common words that contain the sound. And we even practice with tongue twisters to exaggerate each sound. But then I also have them like record themselves. Look, record yourself.
Right, big.
Like record yourself doing this tongue twister 10 times. And just listen to yourself. And it's gonna make so much more sense. It's gonna be way easier to notice these things. To listen to yourself. I think it's a little advanced tip, but I think if it's
you know, you could even get them to make certain YouTube videos of themselves or videos of themselves speaking the language.
Yeah, we do that. There's a certain feeling, like a shame.
Stigma era la palabra que no encontraba en ese momento. Una sensación de desgracia.
There's a certain feeling, like a shame almost, that a lot of Spanish speakers have speaking in English because they're supposed to know the language.
Right.
They're supposed to have learned English already. They're supposed to dominate the language. And so they're very, very, very scared of speaking. Very scared of speaking. And even in low stress environments, like even in a conversation session with other students that's completely locked and no one's going to listen to them, or it's still a little struggle. So yeah, that's why I also like, encouraging them, just read and listen more, and will be better. And then when your speaking is better, then you can speak.
It's a little unfair. People who learn English. Now, of course, in the case of Sweden, where all the little kids watch cartoons in English, they have a big head start when they start school. They will have already listened to, gosh knows how many hours of English, right? But very often, people don't get credit. Say a Spanish speaker from, I don't know, Colombia or somewhere, they don't get credit for speaking English.
No.
Like if a English speaker speaks Spanish, like, wow.
You don't get credit. You don't get credit. Literalmente significa no obtienes crédito. Pero es más como no recibes el elogio que mereces por estar aprendiendo inglés, dado que el inglés se supone que es un idioma que todo el mundo debe saber. Pero en realidad, tú estás haciendo un gran esfuerzo de aprender un segundo idioma. La gran mayoría de personas en el mundo solo sabe un idioma. Entonces you should get more credit. Deberías obtener más elogios, más crédito por tu trabajo de estudiar inglés.
They don't get credit for speaking English.
No.
Like if a English speaker speaks Spanish, like, wow. So even if you make a mistake, wow, that's really good that you're even trying. Good for you. Whereas a non-English speaker speaking English, they kind of feel that they have to achieve this sort of unrealistic level.
Yeah.
And really it's the same. If you really want to be comfortable, then don't bother learning another language, because you will always be more uncomfortable in the foreign language. Always. You'll be searching for words. You will be not pronouncing,
You will always be uncomfortable in a foreign language. You will always be uncomfortable in a foreign language. Siempre vas a estar incómodo usando un idioma extranjero. Nunca va a desaparecer. Yo llevo 8 años hablando español fluidamente y todavía me da nervios o miedo al hablar de temas que no sé muy bien expresar o con personas con quienes todavía no he interactuado mucho, y eso es normal. Hay ciertas cosas que uno tiene que sacrificar para aprender un idioma y mejorar su vida, y una de esas cosas es la comodidad. Vas a estar incómodo hablando inglés por mucho tiempo, va a disminuir por cada vez que sigas avanzando, pero siempre va a estar ahí y hay que abrazarlo.
You will always be more uncomfortable in the foreign language. Always. You'll be searching for words. You will be not pronouncing, ideally. So that's part of the cost. But the benefits are such. If you're from like I've been on an airplane, you sit beside someone who's from Japan and you speak English and he or she speaks English and you can communicate. That's the joy of learning English or any language for that matter.
Yeah.
So, but there are some costs, and one of the costs is that you're very often in an uncomfortable situation. And so you just have to accept that.
I love that. And one last thing. What about motivation? I know you've touched a little on motivation here. What are your thoughts on motivation?
You've touched on motivation. You have touched on motivation. To touch on, tocar sobre, es una expresión en inglés que significa mencionar. You've touched on motivation. Tú has mencionado la motivación.
I know you've touched a little on motivation here. What are your thoughts on motivation? I have thousands of students who struggle with being consistent. They're super motivated one day. They do have a strong purpose for learning, which I know is one thing that you say that you need to have.
Right.
They need to learn the language. Like many of them live in the United States, like they need to learn the language now. But they slowly lose consistency, right? They as soon as they start studying, whether they be classes or courses, they slowly lose consistency and they stop before getting any real results, and then they have to start all over again. And this is like a vicious cycle.
Right.
What advice would you give to these people or these students?
So there are a number of things. First of all, the fact that they stop and then go back in and do it again is not necessarily a bad thing. Like whatever they put in is all positive. So they'll slip a bit when they go back in there. They're very quickly, it's like cross-country skiing. You're going over tracks that someone else has already, like those are your own tracks, but you're going to pick it up right away. That's not a problem. Motivation can be a variety of things. That's why, for example, at Link, and you mentioned this hours you put in, like sometimes when the sort of intrinsic motivation is kind of low, then you need to be nudged. So, for example, before going to Turkey, I said I want to move my known words total from 8,000 to 35,000.
If you don't have enough intrinsic motivation, you need to be nudged. If you don't have, si no tienes enough intrinsic motivation, motivación interna, o sea, un propósito mayor para aprender inglés, unas ganas de levantarte en la mañana a estudiar inglés, you need to be nudged. Necesitas ser nudged. ¿Qué es nudge? Eso. Un empuje. Sí, como que alguien te tiene que empujar. Necesitas un poco de motivación externa.
When the sort of intrinsic motivation is kind of low, then you need to be nudged. So, for example, before going to Turkey, I said I want to move my known words total from 8,000 to 35,000. So sometimes if you can give yourself a measurable external goal, that will keep you going when your intrinsic interest is kind of not quite there.
Yeah.
Another thing is change the content. So if you're doing many stories, then go and do something more difficult. And if the more difficult material is too difficult, go back to the easier stuff. And so move a variety of things. I don't want to fight my way through listening or reading now. Yeah, review vocabulary. Like the key thing is to stay active. But ultimately, the motivation is that sense that one day I'll be comfortable or more comfortable speaking, connecting with people. When I have my moments when I'm doing very well in the language, then I get this great sense of power. Wow, look at me, I'm communicating very well in, say, English. And that'll often be followed by a conversation where you struggled. And you want to make sure you don't let the times you struggle sort of weigh you down. You got to go back at it again and you'll have another positive experience.
Don't let your struggles weigh you down. Don't let your struggles, no dejes que tus luchas weigh you down. Weigh es el peso, ¿verdad? Down es hacia abajo. No dejes que tus luchas te lleven hacia abajo con su peso. Las luchas son parte de la experiencia. la lucha de no entender, la lucha de traducir en la mente, la lucha de tener miedo de hablar, son parte de la experiencia de aprendizaje, pero la clave es don't let your struggles weigh you down.
And you want to make sure you don't let the times you struggle sort of weigh you down. You got to go back at it again, and you'll have another positive experience. Motivation is always going to be inconsistent. There's no way that everybody jumps out of bed every morning totally motivated to learn language. No. And make it easy for yourself. So listening in the car, CarPlay is so convenient. I just jump in the car. I can listen to whatever I want. Vary the subject matter you're listening to. Find ways to make it enjoyable and interesting.
Make it enjoyable and interesting. I think the big problem is in the beginning, because in the beginning, you're repeating these mini stories over and over again. It's not the most enjoyable thing to do. I mean, the most enjoyable thing about language or languages is when you have a little bit of level, so you can actually watch movies, so you can actually watch series, books. That's when it gets really fun.
But I will say,
but
in my own experience, the beginning period is where you have the most immediate, obvious success improvement. Like nothing. Yeah. The language is noise, which is not the case with English learners so much, but you have a limited level in the language. And in that first 3 months or so, all of a sudden, wow, look at me. Like I can understand this now. The most difficult period for me is what we call the plateau. It's sort of going from A2 or B1. Once you're at B2, you've taken off, right? Now you can listen to anything. You may not understand it all, but it's enjoyable.
Se refiere a los niveles de CEFR. Son 6 niveles, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, donde A es el nivel de principiantes, B el nivel intermedio y C avanzado. Y aquí estamos hablando de que cuando llegues al nivel B, a punto de llegar a C, para mí este es el mejor tiempo, porque aquí puedes consumir cualquier contenido y entender. Entonces, el consumo, que es la causa del aprendizaje, ahora se vuelve mucho más interesante. Puedes personalizar tu aprendizaje completamente y sobre todo en inglés, que el mejor contenido, las mejores películas, los mejores podcasts, los mejores libros en todo el mundo son todos en inglés. Brutal.
Once you're at B2, you've taken off, right? Now you can listen to anything. You may not understand it all, but it's enjoyable. But there's a very long period where it seems like there's an endless number of words that you have to learn. You keep forgetting the same stuff. You keep getting the same stuff wrong. And you say, I'll never get there. That's the worst part. The beginning part is you're still full of that initial optimism and you do achieve some success. So personally, I don't find the beginning so bad. I find the plateau is hard.
Got it. I don't know. It's just, since my course has sort of like 6 chapters, I always find that the students who arrive to like chapter 3 or chapter 4, they typically finish the course. But it's the students, they're stuck. Maybe it's mid chapter 1 or barely chapter 2 or barely even 2-3 classes in chapter 1. We would try to combine the intrinsic motivation with some extrinsic one.
Extrinsic, yeah. There's nothing wrong too with someone who is at chapter 3 and struggling. I agree with you. Like chapter 2, chapter 3 is where you're going to lose people. Once they're at chapter 4, they're going to be okay. Let them go back to chapter 1. Like I would also encourage people to if you're fighting the headwinds and it's tough and it's discouraging and stuff, go back and do something that you can cope with and you'll discover things that you didn't notice the first time. And you'll be encouraged to see that actually you are better than when you started. So I often find that if I'm fighting it, I'll go back to easier stuff.
Fantastic. Steve, thank you so much.
Not at all. Very enjoyable.
I love talking about these things.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Of course, our challenge is to motivate. We are naturally motivated to learn languages.
Yeah.
And motivated to talk about language learning.
Yeah.
We have to accept the fact that a lot of people in the world have other interests. If you get a learner on your system who's as motivated as you are, that person will look after themselves.
You're saying that other people are not interested in the subjunctive Spanish tense?
I have heard that there are people who are less obsessed with language learning than we are.
Wow.
Of the 8 billion people on the planet, So the challenge always is to how do you motivate the vast majority of people who have other things going on in their lives?
Yeah, exactly. Make it accessible, make it easy, make it fun.
Exactly.
make it effective so that they get results, so that they, get some momentum going.
Exactly. Reduce the resistance. Yeah.
Yeah. And then use a little scarcity, maybe say, that's not ethical. Like, you just need to stop losing out on opportunities for not speaking English.
Yeah.
That's
The guilt trip thing, I don't think is very effective. Like in Canada, everybody has to learn French because it's the official language. That's not a very strong motivator. Okay. If you tell a kid you have to learn this language because it's the official language, that's not motivating at all. No, I think there has to be more like I'm interested. Like in my case, I became interested in French culture, history, civilization because of a professor I had at university.
Okay.
So it has to be positive. I don't think the guilt trip or the pressure. No.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve. I really
Okay. Kel,
and lovely meeting you.
nice chatting with you. Okay, I'm all fired up now. I'm going to go off and study my Persian.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
I'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Entonces, ¿cómo te fue? ¿Te gustó el video? ¿Cuál lección o idea fue la que más te gustó? Cuéntame en los comentarios. Y si quieres que siga haciendo entrevistas como esta, ¿hay algún invitado especial que te gustaría ver? Déjame saber. Y si aún no lo has hecho, ayúdame por favor a crecer este canal para que sigamos trabajando hacia nuestra visión de un Latinoamérica donde no hay una sola persona que no hable inglés. Entonces, ayúdame con un like, regálame tu me gusta y suscríbete al canal si aún no lo has hecho. Ahora, para obtener un descuento especial en mi curso con una prueba de 2 semanas, te dejo el link a la página de compra abajo en la descripción. En mi curso aprendes a través de historias, a través de mucho input, exposición, que sabemos ahora es la causa del aprendizaje de idiomas, ¿cierto? Recuerda lo que Steve decía, la clave para aprender un idioma rápido es estar muy inmerso en ese idioma, usar el idioma, consumir el idioma todo el tiempo. Y es justamente así como funciona nuestro método. Y con esta oferta, además del descuento, tienes una garantía de satisfacción de 2 semanas. Pruébalo por 2 semanas y si no te gusta, pides el dinero de vuelta. Además, con tu compra tienes una garantía de aprendizaje. Si no eres 100% fluido en inglés después de tomar el curso, te pagamos $1,000 y te damos clases privadas ilimitadas conmigo hasta que seas fluido. Así que no hay nada que esperar. Haz clic en el enlace abajo en la descripción, revisa la página del curso, los resultados de los estudiantes, los precios, los planes de pago y comienza tu prueba ahora.